We're going to talk a little bit more about theme this morning before going into this notion of disposition or arrangement. We want to talk just a little bit more about theme in order to remind ourselves of where we were yesterday, but also to connect what you find, that is in the first canon of rhetoric, invention or discovery, inventio in Latin, to connect what you find with how you arrange it for presentation, okay? And I think that this is where most go most wrong. It is in arrangement or disposition of the material that most go most wrong. So we said this yesterday, that when preachers are beginning, it is generally not the case, that they begin to say utterly false things, that is sort of the problem that they have. Sometimes they're saying Jesus Christ is God, and sometimes they're not so sure. That's not really a problem we have very often. The problem is more that they create sort of misshapen Frankensteins, that what they present is in some way monstrous. It's a body out of order. And when you see discussions, not only in homiletics, but in rhetoric generally, of what it is that you are doing, what it is that you are putting together, this idea of a body is perhaps the most common way that the whole thing is pictured. We even say this when we talk about writing, as in what's the body of the text. You've got footnotes, you've got a header maybe, you have a body of the text, and the body needs to be well constructed. For certain kinds of arguments or certain kinds of problems, disposition is so common and so necessary that the way that things are laid out is just kind of preset. This is what your body looks like. The Apology to the Augsburg Confession is maybe the best example of such a standard body. It's got an introduction, it's got an argument, it's got what's called a confutation, where you take up your opponent's arguments and then refute them, and then it has a peroration at the end, exhorting the one who's reading or listening to the reading to believe these things or to take them seriously. That's a standard forensic or courtroom argument used in the ancient world, and Melanchthon uses it in order to defend the doctrine of the evangelical church, or what's now called the Lutheran church, their doctrine in the face of challenges to it. There's a standard body for handling forensic arguments. Sermons are a little odd because, unlike everything else, they don't fit into any one category of ancient rhetoric. So yesterday we said, for example, that there is much from the past that is then used in the homiletical tradition. The 5 canons of rhetoric, right? Invention, disposition, elocution, memory, and pronunciation. Also, this notion of how do I get people to believe me? We learned from Aristotle, or we were reminded, this is generally the most familiar part of ancient rhetoric that I find people are still aware of, that in order to be convincing or persuasive, I need both logos and pathos, emotion appropriate to that logic, as well as ethos or credibility, which has all kinds of components, okay? Am I lying? Do I follow my own advice? Etc. Okay. What is not really capable of being carried forward identically from pagan rhetoric or ancient rhetoric into Christian homiletics is classifying a sermon as any one kind of speech in ancient terms. So the Greeks and the Romans have different categories of speeches, and those categories are in praise of a particular figure or making an argument for something or other, right? So it could go either way. How do I sway the assembly of the citizens to do what I want them to do? It could be something condemning someone. A Christian sermon could be all three of those things and more at the same time. So it doesn't quite fit in. It also differs in this way, that the matter of coming up with material to talk about is answered very simply, at least for the Lutherans. The material under discussion in a Christian sermon, this sounds obvious, but we know it's really not if we've listened to enough sermons. The material under discussion in a Christian sermon is the inspired scriptures of God. Now that sounds obvious. Here's why it's not. Maybe the pastor invested a great deal more energy in telling a story. Or Pieper mentions that historically there were Lutherans that preached on the Apocrypha, first Maccabees, Tobit, etc. That's generally bound in Luther Bibles, certainly the ones that Concordia Publishing House prints when they print Luther Bibles. Those were still in there. I don't know if they still print them. But the Lutherans are preaching on the Apocrypha, and Pieper says, why not choose instead an inspired text? So the material under discussion is very simple. In an ancient context, or if you get up at your district convention to say something, the material under discussion is not necessarily given. It may be the issue at hand. It may be what you want the assembly to do. It may be what you don't want the assembly to do. But in a sermonic or homiletical context, it's always the inspired scriptures. Why bring this up, these clefts between what the sermon needs to be and what ancient rhetoric needs to be? It's because what we're about to talk about in disposition is a disposition, therefore, not of things that we came up with ourselves. Let's say, for example, that I don't want something that you've proposed at a public meeting to occur. Okay? There are different ways that I can organize that argument. I can say, for example, I'm going to start with my weightiest argument, or I'm going to save my most effective argument for the very end. And I'm going to state it clearly and simply and briefly so that people are like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. Boom, right at the end. There it is. That's what they remember. Now I'm done talking. It may not be that way with the scriptures. It may be that you have a scripture under consideration that isn't organized that way. Take, for example, 1 Corinthians 7. So just flip there in your Bible. We're going to start there today, and I'm starting there because it's one of Paul's more diffuse passages. I do not know where or when it comes up in a lectionary, but where or when it may, the means of presenting it could maybe not be very obvious. Just take, for example, the first paragraph, and in the interest of time this morning, I'm just going to read in the English from 7:1. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man, it's literally in Greek, not to touch a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, why did I pick this at 9 whatever in the morning? Couple of reasons. One is that pastorally, this is a problem you actually run into. Is that when people are having marital problems, they have marital problems, maybe just of this kind, but in addition usually to other long-standing problems, this goes with it. That is, this separation from each other does not exist separately from other kinds of separation, emotional distance, disagreement about finances, etc., etc. So what you have here is, just to start this morning, an extremely pertinent text. Sometimes you get something brought up, like, I don't know, the millennium in Revelation 20, and we were just talking this morning about what people like to talk about in Bible class, what they ask to study. And it's practically perennial that someone wants to study Revelation. And I say, well, we studied Revelation each of the past 18 years at this church. And they say, let's do it again. 19 times. I can't get enough of Revelation, okay? But you get to the millennium, it's really not that hard to figure out. Here's how symbols work in the book. Here's how the world ends. Jesus is king. Have a great day. It's not terribly pertinent to people's everyday lives, but then here's a text that is. You are having marriage problems. Look what you're generally doing to each other. Okay? So here, it's sitting right here. So it's pertinent. That's nice. But it's also awkward. How do I talk about these things? And one thing to notice is that if you have the Greek open, you'll notice that the Greek is a little more circumspect than the English. For instance, the Greek will say, do not touch. And the English is just like, here's what that means, right? So this is also something to notice, is that the language that you are afforded in the translation you're reading, and I don't know what the New King James is, that are NASB, I don't have that in front of me, but whatever translation you're reading may actually force you to discuss certain things because it's being more explicit, really, than the scriptures themselves are. So I've got pertinent, but I've also got awkward. In addition to pertinency and awkwardness, I have a third factor going on here, that there is a lot contained just in these 5 verses. The importance of self-control. The idea that married people's bodies and lives, by extension, do not belong to themselves. So this question of possession or the nature of marriage. In addition to that, the idea that there could be devotion to prayer for some kind of purpose. All of this is a little hard to explain. The reason we started here is because it's hard. Because sometimes when you're thinking of themes, or you're thinking of, well, how do I arrange this and set it out, it's easy. I find it, for instance, easy if I'm coming up with a series of talking points for a meeting or something to organize my arguments. It's not really that hard. I came up with them. I'm not going to come up with something that is necessarily horribly awkward to discuss, even if pertinent. Simple. And sometimes you get a parable like the prodigal son, and it's easy. And sometimes you don't. So you don't have to come up with a theme right now for this text, and we can just leave it for the rest of the week. The point, though, is that you want to come up with something that not only thematically, but in its arrangement, is faithful to the text. Because it's especially tempting not to be faithful to the text when it would be so much easier to just dance around it, either out of embarrassment or because, perhaps also in addition to your embarrassment, or because it is too pertinent. Sometimes you know something matters and you know it would help, but you just don't want to talk about it because it just lands too well. And then you might have problems and people might need to talk to you after the service, pastor, etc. And you don't want to do that. You just want to go get your coffee and your donut, whatever the case may be. So we start here because what we're considering, especially this morning, is how I remain faithful to the text, not only in coming up with something to say, but in coming up with a way of saying it, a method, an arrangement that is faithful to it. Before we go anywhere else, do you have an idea about what you would do here that you would like to share with the brothers? Anybody? at all? You probably don't. Not at 9:30. I didn't think so. And that's fine. That's fine, right? Because it's kind of a strange text. Does it appear anywhere in a lectionary? Would someone please look that up while we go somewhere else? I would bet you it doesn't, but I'm not going to bet you much because I don't believe in gambling. But I would bet you that it doesn't. Generally, awkward things are avoided in the lectionaries. Does it?
I was going to ask, does the Song of Solomon ever appear?
Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon does not appear. Okay, so Tom's got our answer right. So it does not appear, which is fine. I mean, Ephesians 5 appears. Yes, it does. And people feel awkward enough about that one. That's one of the ones where, like we were saying yesterday, the pastor kind of like smashes the accelerator as he goes through certain texts. And then he's like, well, you have to submit to your husband, moving on, to something else, right? Don't want to spend too much time on that. Does it appear anywhere? It would probably be Lectio Continua in a summer in the 3-year. So.
Proper 8.
Proper 8?
8. 8A.
Okay. And how much is it?
1 through 13.
1 through 13. Kudos to the lectionary committee. Good job, guys. Because if you keep going, these are things that come up in people's lives constantly. Amazing.
Let me see what you would be skipping in the gospel if you.
Yeah, what would I be skipping in the gospel reading? And by skipping in the gospel reading, what we really mean is skipping in the epistle if I don't preach on it. Because they hear it, so they're going to hear in Ephesians 5 the word submit, or here they're going to hear, oh yeah, that was us in our marriage 13 years ago, whatever. And then I just skip over it and I'm like, well, this is a really nice story about when Jesus was very kind to someone. What's
All right. It's from Matthew 10. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword.
Okay, good. There we go. That's my intro. Yeah. There's a sword in your marriage. Okay, here we go. I got my theme ready to go. This is fantastic.
I mean, you almost like when Ephesians 5 shows up, or this text, you almost have to preach on it. I'm almost compelled to preach.
I'm not finding 1 Corinthians 7 in here.
Oh, you're right. I was looking wrong at it, wasn't I? Sorry.
Okay. No, it's not.
Sorry.
That part of
7 is not in the...
just the, like, verse 29 on. So I just went through all of them.
Jim had me all excited for life, and now I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, we're on the 3-year right now. I don't know if that's going to continue. So Dave said that when things like Ephesians 5 come up, he almost feels compelled to preach on them. Is that true for anyone else? When it comes up, you feel practically compelled to preach on it. Why do you feel compelled?
Because of the confusion around the text.
Yeah, so especially, we didn't really talk about this yesterday with text choice. If I hear 3 texts and one of them I know sounds weird, that's the one that I want to handle. Especially if the gospel is, Jesus healing somebody, they're fine with that. They're not confused about that. Yeah. And, healings have not determined the way that they speak to each other at the dinner table and then the way the rest of the evening goes that week. Whereas certain verbs like submit probably did. So, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Our eldest here, if Romans 10 comes up, he's preaching on that no matter what the gospel is. I've been here long enough to notice that.
Romans 10. Yeah, I mean, it could be a favorite text, and that's always nice when a favorite text comes up and you're just excited, like I was just now. sadly, right? But it's also, I think, I mean, there are certain things incumbent on you, and one of them is the clarification of things that are unclear, especially unclear things that touch on the person's life directly. And if I mean, I can leave it. I can say, you'll figure it out, or or even more dangerously, you remember when I preached on that 6 years ago, which they don't. But yeah, I share your sense. Yeah, that if it's there, I kind of need to do something. I need to do something with it. Let me give you some examples of themes that Pieper comes up with. Bless you. Because I think that some of us, as with disposition and everything else about preaching, we are prone to get into what we might call grooves, or what someone else might call ruts. Okay? What's the difference really in sheer repetition of how we do things? So he's going to give multiple different ways of stating themes, and that'll get us into multiple different ways of arranging the text. So he's got narrative themes. So an example is the struggle of Jesus in Gethsemane. Narrative themes. And so the theme is going to be arranged in story form. That is, the main burden of the thing that I'm doing in the sermon is telling the story. Okay. He's got painterly or picture themes. Now, this is interesting. Consider this, for example, the betrayal of Judas. And what he's doing there is not so much retelling the story as portraying a scene to you. You guys know what a tableau is? Where a bunch of people dress up as they might for like a play or something, but then the point of it is to be frozen in some specific position in order for that to be painted historically, or today photographed. So the church fathers do this very frequently. There's a Greek term for it called ekphrasis. Ekphrasis. And what they do there is that they take something that would otherwise be maybe narrated or perhaps assumed by the preacher, and instead he devotes enormous energy, usually near the beginning of the sermon, to painting a picture. So if I want to get you to feel, for example, a certain way about the betrayal of Judas, I will paint the picture, verbally obviously, in ways that are going to be compelling to you. The assumption here is that, and this is where Pieper is a little bit different from Walther again, the assumption here is that there is wide, what we would call, if we were talking about sculpture or painting or music, there is wide artistic variety in the art of preaching. So not every painter is going to paint, even if realistic. He's not going to frame things the same way. He's not going to light things the same way. He's not going to use the same color palette, even for the same subject, let alone using the same subject as someone else. So I think the reason that we get into ruts or grooves is that certain things come more easily, as with any artist, to each of us than others. So my, habit of mind is such that this is easier for me than if you said, please give something that sounds like a dogmatic lecture, but is actually a sermon in a church service. Okay, that would be hard. I would have to force myself to do that, especially if it weren't something like Romans. Other preachers do something that sounds a lot like a dogmatic lecture practically every time they preach. So painterly themes. Another example is sort of like the German word means like assertive themes, but it's something that demands a proof, a theme demanding proof. Okay. A really interesting example he uses is that Christ is the true city of refuge for all sinners. So this image from Numbers of the city of refuge that gets built, and you have one that is sufficiently accessible for each person who has accidentally shed blood in Israel. And then he runs, remember? And then the pursuer is going to come after him, and he has to run faster than the pursuer and get into the city before the pursuer, rightfully outside the city, overtakes him and sheds his blood. Helpful to remember when you're getting into the stories about the armies of Saul and of David and of the shedding of blood in various places, right? Why is this happening? How does this work? Helpful to remember that part of the law at that point. But the point here is that he's going to take that, and notice what he's doing. He's reading the Old Testament as if it speaks of Christ everywhere. So Christ is the true city of refuge. We don't have physical cities that you run to and then you're innocent of sin anymore. We have Christ, and Christ is proclaimed or offered. We are baptized into him. His forgiveness is given out. And at that point, that's the city of refuge I'm looking for. The theme demands that that be proven. So at that point, what I'm thinking about in disposition is what causes for doubt might people have? They could have a purely hermeneutical cause for doubt. Where are you getting that in the Old Testament, Pastor? It doesn't say in Numbers that they're going to build another city, but it's called Jesus or something. So how does that work? So you have to prove how the Bible fits together. In addition, they may doubt what else? If you say Christ is the true city of refuge for all sinners, they may doubt that they're going to actually make it into the city, right? Is this a city I can come into? Are the gates open to me, right? So a theme demanding proof. I think a lot of times this is what themes sound like. So some of these options, some of them are maybe a little odder. The painterly theme, I mean, how often does that happen? Narrative, perhaps. This one, I think, happens very frequently. That a theme demanding proof, and then the preacher provides the proof. Others, and I want to talk about lettuce sermons. Other themes have to do with prayers, wishes, desires. Just a very simple example of such a theme is the Lord Jesus be with your spirit. Okay. I think these are often, they can lend themselves to being weak rhetorically for this reason, that it sounds like a series of wishes that I have for you. And then the question you ask yourself, sort of like when you sit at a graduation speech and they talk about your future or the future of this class, and every high school or college class, no matter how humble or small, is full of people whose futures are going to be magnificent or bright or worthwhile, right? Is that it sounds airy-fairy. It sounds pie in the sky. It sounds insubstantial. So if you have such a theme, especially a theme that is framed in terms of a prayer or a desire, it might be in Greek or Hebrew in like a subjunctive sort of a form, let this be. You have to be very careful that what you're saying has something concrete inside of it in the way that you dispose the text. A lettuce sermon is one that ends with several mentions of what, if you're not listening or enunciating carefully, sounds like discussion of iceberg and romaine lettuce, because especially the last paragraph will be full of the locution, let us then, dear brethren, let us, my friends in Christ, let us do this, let us be that. And it's sort of like, okay, that would be nice, but I don't know how, or I don't know why to be that or do that. And so what happens is that the sermon comes off as pious and empty. You do not doubt the preacher's piety. You doubt whether he has any gray matter, right? So you have to be very careful with those sorts of themes.
Do you think that that lettuce problem also has to do with the kind of transition that's taken place from second person to first person? Because, for instance, sometimes when I conclude my sermons, I will tell them my prayer for you on the basis of what I just said is this.
Yeah.
And I find that rhetorically effective, but not, I find the lettuce, not very rhetorically effective. So, but when I specifically say my prayer for you now is this.
Right. Yeah. So whenever you use the second person, you have a bigger risk and a bigger payoff. If you use the second person, you have the risk that you are going to overstep your bounds, whatever those bounds might be, or you might be invasive in a way that just kind of turns them off. It tastes bitter to them. But if it pays off, it's magnificent, right? Compare, for example, the difference between hearing, and most churches don't even do this anymore, but hearing the declaration of grace versus the absolution at the beginning of the service, right? The declaration of grace is conditional and categorical, but it's not personal. It quotes the Bible. Whoever believes and is baptized shall be saved. Grant this, O Lord, unto us all. That's a prayer, and it's fine. And like we said, psychologically, maybe not everyone is completely terrified constantly, and they're not going to die if a declaration of grace is said, as it was, in fact, pretty much at every church service prior to TLH. Because the old common service only had a declaration of grace, and the church kept existing somehow. It is, just notably, however, far more powerful for the pastor to say, I forgive you. Now, when people come into our churches, especially from evangelical churches, just that phrase, let alone anything you say in the sermon, can be very offensive to them. What do you mean, I forgive you? Who are you to forgive them? So when you're doing the second person, it's way more powerful because let us is sort of, okay, I don't know. My prayer for you sounds more like dad, so there's more on the line. If you're really dad, then that's wonderful. Dad's praying for me. Fantastic, right? But if you're not really dad and you're just kind of like some punk, so I don't do that when I preach at a congregation that's my. No, I'm saying I could be a punk. I know he's not a punk. I know I am. If I went to a congregation that's not mine and I say, maybe at the end, my prayer for you is that this congregation is blessed, but very generic. But if I'm preaching on 1 Corinthians 7, which I don't know why I would do that at a congregation, I don't know. But let's say I'm free texting because I'm like, they need to hear this, and I'm not coming back, so there's nothing on the line here. But at the end of the sermon, I say, my prayer for you is that your marriages be blessed with harmony. It's not that I'm wrong. It's just I'm putting a lot on the line because they're going to be like, who are you? What do you know about any of this? So second person is you're driving a fast car. So you could get there really fast or you could, smash into the barricade,
Yeah, I just noticed that Pieper's prayer theme is in the second person, not a let us. So
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Because the let us is a species of a more general issue that guys not only talk about, but I generally get this question should I say something like if I speak in the second person, especially about sin, should I then speak almost immediately or before then in the first person plural about sin? Or should I speak in the first person singular about sin? So especially with the goal, malady, means framework where there's always something wrong with the congregation, which is a big assumption to make every time you stand up and you preach, there's something wrong with them. That's the malady. So I understand, especially within that framing, why you would want to never say in the second person that there's something, because what it sounds like is, okay, here's the goal that I have constructed. Here's the malady. That's what's wrong with you or people generally. But remember that the setting of a sermon is a man speaking in a monologue at people. So there's just kind of a power imbalance between the congregation that's having their sin exposed and the man who's up front talking. So even if I say, I need Jesus's forgiveness just like you do, it doesn't sound natural necessarily. It sounds very often like I'm kind of hedging my bets because I just laid into you. So I understand, especially within that common Kemmerer framework, why pastors are very reluctant to use the second person in their sermons, even though rhetorically it's simply way more effective to say you rather than to say we or I, unless you are in fact only talking about yourself. An example that I notice of this in the New Testament that I have not really seen anyone talk about, to be honest with you, but it has affected my own preaching, is that Paul will describe in immediate description, right, with pronouns, he will describe himself as a sinner. In fact, the foremost sinner or the chief sinner, right? He does not address anyone, not even the Corinthians, as sinners. Okay? It does not mean that he does not believe that they are sinful in some way. It does matter rhetorically the words that you use to talk to people. How, when, and in what manner you lay certain things open. And he is willing to lay himself open in that way. I mean, foremost sinner implies there are lots of other ones. That even as a Christian, he is a sinner. That's especially described in the second half of Romans 7. But he doesn't say, you Corinthian sinners. The time when he uses it, ironically, is when in talking about how Peter betrayed the gospel by refusing to eat with Gentile Christians, he says, and we are not Gentile sinners like they are, right? Using that really just kind of an ethnic epithet, Gentile sinners, ironically there, right? So the issue is not just what is true. Yes, they are sinners, but how do I go about saying this?
What about Galatians? Like, who has bewitched you?
Yeah. So I'm not saying that Paul is never harsh.
He just doesn't use that specific.
Correct. Yeah. Because with the Galatians, he is very harsh. I mean, he's so harsh, he doesn't even stop to say, thanks for reading my letter before going, which with everybody else he does. I mean, the Corinthians are such a mess. And I think we probably talked about this a little bit last year, but the Corinthians are you get the call papers and you just look through, here's how much debt they have. You talk to the elders, these are the ongoing situations, and you're just like, no, no, I don't want to deal with that. No. Okay, that's the Corinthians, but with the Corinthians, he can still stop and say, it's so great that you believe in Jesus Christ, blah, 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 before he starts But with the Galatians, yes, he is abrupt. And he calls them foolish. Yeah. But this idea of what am I going to say about you directly is always one that's going to tie into what's my theme, but also how am I going to arrange things? Because if I arrange everything as a proof, think about it this way, if everything is a proof, then the congregation never really is terribly involved in the sermon. Okay. Sometimes a strength of the praying or wishing or desiring kind of a theme is that it can be a desire very specifically for their life. My prayer for you is that you are, whatever, blessed in Christ. Right? Along those lines, along these pronominal lines are warning themes. Warning themes. So Pieper's example is, do not gather for yourselves treasures on earth, but rather in heaven. So you know the text that's going on there. What's going to happen then is that it's going to be arranged such that the whole sermon is a warning. Are warnings remembered more easily than some other things? I think they are. I think they are. Sunday's sermon, it was not my theme. Theme was God's discipline shows his love. Didn't state the theme verbally. There was a warning in the middle of the sermon about being ignorant of the Bible. Perhaps Gene remembers it, or Nathan, or Josh remembers it, I don't know. I know Les remembers it. Les remembers everything, right? But it wasn't the theme. Warning themes can come off as very heavy, okay? So if someone is always warning me, I begin not to listen. It would be like having, I grew up in a small town, the fire alarm went off at noon every day at the fire station. Okay, the fire alarm goes off at 1:20, then I listen to it. But if it goes off at noon, it could have been a fire that's burning down half the town. I don't know. It always goes off at noon. And some pastors have a certain tone about them where they are always going off at noon and 1 and 2 and 3. And so you tend just not to listen anymore because they're always going off. They're always warning you. They're always dour or bitter or whatever the case may be. So you just kind of stop listening. Another kind of a theme could be questioning themes. And these, he doesn't even really have too many examples because there's so many possible ones. I think you can understand I'll give you an example. What is the Christian's true treasure on earth? Going along with the same text from the Sermon on the Mount as the warning theme, what is the Christian's true treasure on earth? And then you answer it. Those are easiest to make. Does anyone require confirmands to take sermon notes? You do. Do you have like a schema or like a form for them set out anywhere?
I used to.
Yeah, this idea of sermon notes is going the way of the dinosaurs. And maybe that's good, but maybe it's just also because we're more disorganized than we used to be. So an example, guy I know, he specifically states his theme and major divisions at the beginning of every sermon. So, I mean, I would just lose my mind if I had to commit to that for the rest of my life, but he does it. Great, right? Very old-fashioned that way. So he does this. The confirmands are then supposed to listen. They write down the theme. They write down the major divisions. Then the next thing they have to do is figure out when and where those were. Okay? So that's like, yeah, I would go crazy if I had to do that. And I don't think every text is organized that way. But he's a very old school kind of a guy. Not that old, but old school. And so since he does this, the confirmands know, they can tell you exactly, this is what the sermon was about, which is valuable. Even though I would go crazy doing it, it's sort of like there's something better about that in a way than what I'm doing where I'm not announcing the theme. And so I know what I'm doing, but people are picking up various things and I'm not controlling that so much. Whereas in this model, it's very controlled what you're supposed to pick up. And so they can write down exactly what they're supposed to pick up. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. And questioning themes lend themselves to this. So you will find, especially if you get an old book of Lutheran sermons on the catechism, for example, is that the sermon themes will often be questioning themes. Because it's sort of like giving a lecture. And that was, I want to say, the most common way that we preached. Was almost in lecture form, perhaps with emotion, perhaps with whatever that you don't usually have, maybe when you're covering something on a PowerPoint, but it was the most common way that we preach. And it inculcated doctrine, 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 which when we talk about the fivefold use, you'll see perhaps why they did that. Did anyone grow up with sermon notes or announced themes, these sorts of things, even if you don't do them? Nathan did, Jim did, you did it in confirmation, yeah. Yeah, and I think that was more common. There are still places where it happens, but it's way less common than it used to be.
I think Christine was doing sermon notes last fall. So I don't know if Cheryl was just encouraging it during.
So the kids here do take sermon notes, but I want to say it's more impressionistic, or, what exactly am I supposed to, I just kind of write down some things the pastor said, whereas this is a structure the pastor is building in the way that we do for catechism classes. Today we're doing the third commandment. Here's what you don't do, here's what you do. Very schematic and clear, and sermons looked more like that generally. I mean, it's easier to take notes in that way. Yeah, for sure.
I had a pastor growing up who had a fill in the blank, like sermon Mad Lib kind of thing in the bulletin that the whole congregation was supposed to fill out.
Yeah, okay. So have you ever seen that where you have the sermon fill in the blank? Did you see that anytime before the 1990s? You did?
Take it back. No, it was very, very early 90s. That's right.
Okay. Because the reason I asked that is because that became very popular as of late 80s, early 90s, because Rick Warren, now you guys are just dismissing it. I'm trying to speak in, there's some things to be said in favor of it. Rick Warren did it at Saddleback Church, and he did it so that people would know what he said. And it feels kind of stupid, or it's like, sermon Mad Libs. Okay, yep, I heard that. What's next? Okay, I'm supposed to be confident in Jesus. Good. Now, I'm supposed to be careful in prayer, right? And it's often alliterative, and we can make fun of it. People knew what they were saying. But that's where that came from, that fill in the blank thing. Prior to the women pastors, yes. This is probably 25 years before the women pastors. But don't worry, there's a difference between the gift of ministry and the office of ministry. So that's what Rick Warren recently came up with, right? But that was the fill in the blank. The fill in the blank, I think part of the reason not to do it is because that requires a lot more preparation on our part. Whereas now it's like, well, I could come up with this at like 7:30 on Sunday morning, and it could be okay. I would not recommend that at all, but you could. Fill in the blank requires you to have it ready for whenever the bulletin's printed. So, I used to take sermon notes, and then I found that sermons were so sufficiently similar, I could have made the fill in the blank. So then I didn't need to take sermon notes anymore. Yeah. Back to that issue of predictability. Couple more kinds of themes, and then we'll march into disposition. We're going to take a break about 10:30 this morning. Conditional themes. Okay, conditional themes. So these will usually have to do with the Christian life. Okay, so that only he who begins his marriage in the name of Jesus will be blessed in it. Only he who begins his marriage in the name of Jesus will be blessed in it. That would obviously be a wedding sermon. I wonder if in 1903 people listened to wedding sermons any more closely than they do today. I would guess that they don't, right? Yeah. Doubting themes. Do you think that someone can hide himself so well that God would not see him? I like that. I like that one. And a doubting theme is a question, but it's a rhetorical question. It's not a question I need to sincerely answer somewhere in the sermon. Yeah, that's a good one. Isaiah, I find Isaiah extremely easy to preach on because it's so beautiful already. Schematic themes, he doesn't like these, but here are some examples. Believers are fruitful branches in Christ, or the sword of godly righteousness. Schematic. So his issue here is that you're basically cooking up a way of teaching things. So I will often do this, not when I'm giving a sermon, but when I'm giving a lecture. So I'm doing the Montana District Pastors Conference in October, and I'm talking about moving from initial evangelism to church planting. And I have 9 lectures. So the schema that I'm building is going to involve rafting, and then obstacles you face, and here's your landing site, and how do you get there, okay? So that's my scheme, and I like to build schemes that are pictures because it's easy to narrate and it's easy for people to follow, rather than something that's like intellectual or abstract. So if you do that in a sermon, that's gonna be, the Christian builds his house on Christ. My scheme is somehow a house or something like that. And so this is what Paul is doing when he's allegorizing in Galatians 4. So the word allegory, as we're going to talk about probably after our break and talking about exposition, allegory is a word that, like expository, takes on about 1,000 different definitions over the course of church history. When Paul is using allegory in Galatians 4, what he's really doing is building what Pieper calls a scheme. That is just kind of a picture that helps you remember things. But we're not saying that Christians are literally branches, or that Sarah wasn't a historical person in Genesis, but really just she's really just a representation of the church or something. We're not saying that, but the scheme says, hold on, I'm making this picture, follow this picture with me. So that's the idea. I find that this is fairly uncommon among Lutherans because, I think mostly because of sermon length. The reason I build schemas, especially when I have lecture series, are because I have to talk for like 9 hours. So I need them to hold the 9 hours together rather than standing up and saying, now we're talking about this, and now we're talking about that, and now our schema for this class, for example, is very simple. It's not very artistic, but we're moving from preparing the sermon to delivering the sermon. That's kind of simple. But if I only really have to talk for 15 minutes, I don't really need a schema to do that.
But Hebrews 12 on Sunday was schematic.
It was schematic. It was beautiful, wonderful to preach. And I organized it around different kinds of sons. So I started out talking about Cain and Abel. I talked about Esau. At the end, I talked about the son and his blood, which speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Right? And so sometimes that's right up front, and then other times it's in the background. Usually in my preaching, I find it's in the background. But with something that's long, I put it out front to help their memory.
Yeah, I've found that when I got to the congregation, they were used to 12-minute sermons, and I'm 20 plus most weeks now. And to get them there, one of the things I found helpful was to use schematic images. And they were definitely probably more in the background, I'd say, but to give them an image in the introduction and to carry that image of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the schematic can also be image focused. So this is where I find that painterly themes, like we said earlier, and schematic themes often go together, because especially if you can paint a picture for somebody, then you can use that to move through what you're moving through, right? So son, okay? And I didn't retell all of those stories, right? So I think that some of these go together more easily than others. When you're evaluating your own preaching or someone else's, one of the chief things you can look for is he usually, for example, asking questions? So I think that asking questions can be very difficult for people to follow because you're asking them not just to sort of sense the logic of what you're saying, you're actually asking them to follow the logic of what you're saying, like intellectually. And when the preacher, especially, is moving through transitions by means of questions, the questions might be intended by him to be sincere, like, okay, I'm going to open up the next section of the sermon by asking this question, and I'm going to answer it. Okay, a theme or disposition demanding proof, for example, but we're going to do this by means of questions. But the problem is if the person couldn't lock on to what you just said, now you've already moved on, and they're lost, and now they're going to be even more lost. So some things to consider with themes, and especially variety in themes, is not only what would actually set the text out best, but what can also be followed. This is why hard and fast, this is the way you do it, opinions always have to be given with a caveat in preaching, because it is artistic, it is not scientific. Right? So in the classical sense of those words, something like dogmatics is scientific. You either have the correct knowledge of this doctrine from Scripture or you don't. With preaching, I can say, well, you built that house in a very awkward way, or that body is kind of misshapen that you made there, but it's still a body, or it's still a house. I mean, you achieved something. You didn't destroy everything. So there are kind of degrees here precisely because, maybe later you realize they weren't following me, or I didn't paint the picture very well, or I'm just not good at telling stories, so I need to get better at that, or whatever the case may be, right? There's one last kind of theme, and then we'll introduce disposition before our break, and that is a theme that names the subject. These sound rather boring. I don't think they have to be, but they sound boring. Repentance. What is my theme? Faith. True repentance. Okay. This doesn't sound boring. It might sound morbid. The longing to die. That's actually a sermon that should be preached sometime, somewhere. People express such a longing. Someone should talk about it in a sermon. But the issue here is that it can lead to relative obscurity because you're not actually requiring yourself in the theme to assert anything particularly, either implicitly or explicitly. You're just saying what you're talking about. And I think that's where a lot of guys stop. Their theme is actually just a topic. And then they kind of go on about the topic for whatever amount of time. The difficulty there is that when you do that, when you don't propose something, you don't assert anything, either in question form or indicative form. When you don't do that, it's a little hard for you to know, and therefore also for your hearer to know, what it is that you're saying, right? Because it's just sort of 5 thoughts at more or lesser length about the topic. So here's the topic. Here's some things that I think. Okay. What's the issue there? Something that Pieper's going to aim at throughout his homiletics is the hearer's memory. The hearer's memory. So we talked yesterday about this notion that behind preaching is very often some sort of educational theory, either formal or informal, announced in the footnotes or endnotes or not, but some kind of educational theory. And behind the educational theory is some sort of idea about who these people are. Are they, for instance, as we talked about yesterday, regenerate Christians or not? Do I know them or don't I? In addition to that, they have certain faculties. They have a will. They have emotions. They have an understanding or a reason, those being the same word in German, reason and understanding. they also have very deeply a memory, and he's shooting for it every single time. I want them to remember. So we said yesterday, for example, the reason I have a clear theme is so that they have a handle on the suitcase. So all the stuff that I give them can be easily picked up and taken home. In his time, it's usually verbally announced, but that's why. Because it will help the memory. It will help the memory. There are other things that help the memory that somewhat like sermon notes are beginning to disappear or are gone or would be unfamiliar if I said, for example, when you go home today, discuss the sermon over the lunch table. Discuss the sermon. Well, that's a lot easier to do if you can remember it or remember more than that was a weird thing that he said, or that was funny when he said this, or whatever the case may be. If the sermon is aimed at memory, it makes discussion and kind of profiting from it better. Does anyone know Stark's prayer book? Okay, it's been around for a while. It was in German, then it was in English, then it was gone for a long time. Now it's back, updated, right? Stark's prayer book, if you read the prayer for the end of Sunday, it's about profiting from the sermon. Okay, and you can say, well, it's so sad they didn't have communion. Yep, sure, agreed. But they did focus on the sermon, and that was good. And what they were trying to do with the sermon was to get more out of it. Now, I know that people do this because they'll say that they go back and they listen to the sermon again. Or these days, they even watch the sermon again. And that's good. But that's never everybody, obviously. So if the sermon is designed from the start for memorability, then it's going to be easier to be profited from. So I can remember, for example, certain things that teachers said in 3rd grade. In that case, that was a reprimand for laughing at somebody else, okay, which was just an assault on the fact that I laugh easily, right? And they just weren't, I have a disability, you know, and so they didn't respect that. But I remember that rebuke, to put it in sermonic terms, that rebuke. Or I remember, other things that I was taught or whatever. And the reason I do is because of how the person said it. I don't think this is ever going to be true for every sermon. I don't think anyone is going to be, Ted Williams doesn't come up to the plate and, get a base hit every time. But the definition of his excellence as opposed to somebody you don't remember, like Andy Van Slyke. Anybody remember Andy? You do. Impressive. Okay, Andy Van Slyke, Cardinal fan. Pirates. Yeah, well, when the Pirates were the absolute worst team in baseball reliably every year for most of the 2000s, there was a blog of suffering called Where Have You Gone, Andy Van Slyke? And so that's why I remember Andy Van Slyke. But the reason that Ted Williams is more famous than Andy Van Slyke, among other reasons that you might choose, is because he more consistently gets a base hit than almost anybody else. Okay, so you're not going to bat 1,000, but you should try to bat 342. That would be good. And one way to bat 342 to make sure that you have a nice solid swing is to aim at their memory, because that will just simply work more often than anything else. I would say, for example, that their memory is going to be affected differently the longer they know you. So preaching in places where they don't already know me, generally the first thing or the only thing that they remember is public speaking skills. Once you move past that, once they don't care about that, then it's going to go into actual substance. And so at that point, you're aiming in the memory, in the theme, and the disposition, because certain things will just kind of go away, right? So if you have a honeymoon with a congregation, or you're just there for one Sunday or something, they're probably just going to remember, I liked the joke he made, or I liked that he looked at us, or whatever the case is. We're talking about you're playing for the same team 365 days a year. How are you going to do this? You're going to aim at the memory in order to make sure that, there are very few games out of 162 that you don't get on base somehow, right? Before we go on to disposition, do you guys have other theme things you want to discuss, or you want to talk about memory? Do people have memories anymore since they're on their phones all the time?
I've given up on that. I really have.
Okay.
And it drives me nuts when I expect people to remember what I say, and they don't. So I've come around to the idea that the sermon is like the rest of the service, a ritual act, and it affects people's soul regardless of whether it affects their mind or not. So that's just, and I'm at much more peace with that than I am trying to preach a memorable sermon. So it may not be helping anybody else, but hey, I'm good.
Is anyone else in the same place? Like, I've given up on memorability. One of the points Bob is making there is the relationship of the sermon to the rest of the service. And that's something that you will not find Pieper or Kemmerer really talking about. The sermon is sort of its own thing.
Is that because of their discipline, that they're homileticians, or?
That's interesting. I think that's what they're talking about.
We were to add Reinhold Pieper sitting here and engaging, he may say, oh, of course, yeah, the importance of the Agnus Dei or something,
Right.
Maybe he would. Maybe it's just because I'm writing a book on homiletics.
Right. Yeah, I think about this, for example, that I've seen plenty of people leave before communion because they need to go somewhere. Not just because they're angry, right? But they'll leave before communion. But the idea that you would leave before the sermon is would be very unusual. Also, that this is all anecdotal, so this is for the purposes of discussion. I have never heard a congregation say, we want someone who is just outstanding in the service of the sacrament. Maybe rightly administered, right? So the congregation is very specific. We want someone that's going to whatever, practice close communion, whatever, or practice open communion. But that they want a strong preacher is practically universal in a congregation that's calling a pastor. Yeah.
So inherently, I don't know if sermons are memorable because you get it weekly. It's inherently a hammer. So to try to make it memorable is nearly impossible because most of us have been through thousands and thousands of sermons. And most times I think sermons are written for that moment, not for 10 years later.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the moments, so I referenced third grade, the moments in any part of my education that are actually immediately capable of recall are very few. Right. And it would be the same way with sermons. I don't think that Pieper is intending to make that sermon as an event memorable, but rather what is said imprints itself on the memory. And memory is not a faculty that is about immediate recall. I think that's all we think of. But it's about what is there that later on I will realize is there, but did not know was there. And I think in that way, it makes a little bit more sense out of what's happening in a sermon. It doesn't have to be as an event memorable in the same. I've only been to one NFL game live that was memorable. I mean, I've never been back to another one because of what I remember seeing grown men do and embarrass themselves at an NFL game, but it was memorable, right? But the sermon doesn't have to be memorable in that way. But yeah, you're right. There's thousands. And it's not like, well, what sermon did you hear in, the first Sunday in August in 2005? I have no idea. Yeah.
I would just say, Bob was my pastor for a while, so I listened to a number of his sermons. I can't say that I can remember any particular sermon. What I do remember is that as he preached, the word helped form my mind and my thought for that week. And in terms of my faith, I found it useful. But another thing, strangely enough, I can remember a sermon that was preached by Henry Eggold over 50 years ago. I remember the text. I mean, in fact, it was, and they crucified him. And he pointed out each of those words. I still remember that sermon. So it's strange.
It's good, I mean, that's good. If anyone can do that, that's good. Henry Eggold is kind of your non-Aho guy at Springfield and Fort Wayne.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think some of it might depend on memory, but then I think if they have like something kind of like a twist on something, so like the one I'm going to preach here in a couple weeks, Luke 15, I remember Wolf Miller one time said he called them the dumb parables. So that's always been in my mind because they're not the way we would think of things according to human wisdom. Like Jesus says, well, who went leave, their 99 sheep to go find the one? Well, no one would. Like, that's crazy. We'd say that's acceptable law. So you remember those phrases, and then I think it helps build them.
I preached that in Wyoming with like 4 sheep people. And I got lined out immediately. Pastor, I know that sheep. I'm going to get it. And I've never preached that again. Well, that's ridiculous. Why would you go after another sheep? And they said, because that's my sheep. I mean, it was brilliant. It was beautiful.
Yeah, that is beautiful. That's your John 10. That's your John 10 sermon. You can get, they don't know. I mean, they just visit nature in Denver, so you can say whatever you want. Yeah. Yeah.
I think speaking from the experience of a long-term pastor, the way that, for instance, I use memory is you come to a congregation, you see that there are things that need to be accomplished and moved in a certain direction, and so you thematically use, oh, he's talked about that before, and you just build off that, in my case, through the years, in order to get to places like, when I came here, there was no chalice, right? So we've got to start building on that, or having every Sunday communion, you need to, so you use memories as, oh, he keeps talking about that, maybe we ought to act on this. And so that's the way I've seen, or at least personally seen, memory being used.
Which has to do with, when we were talking about text choice yesterday, planning your preaching. If it is planned, then it's easier to say, here's what I'm doing over the next whatever amount of time that I'm building on. Yeah. Do we have another hand over here? I can't remember. You're okay. Yep. Okay. So when memory is aimed at, I do think, and Dwight remembered things from Bob, so I don't know if Bob doesn't seem to be succeeding in not being memorable. Might be unpredictable, but he's memorable. Yeah, Jim.
I will say, I mean, I know there's a few talented cantors in this world. I haven't been around many in my experience, at my congregations. So I pick every hymn. I don't allow the organist to. I don't allow somebody else to. I pick every hymn. And that way, like take my daughter. She can remember lyrics to songs. Anything you put to song, she will remember. Right. That's the way she learns. And so if I can make sure that the hymns that I select are reinforcing, what I'm preaching, then I think people do take it home. I mean, that if they're, you have visual learners, you have, whatever you have, if you can hit people in different ways, then they could maybe take it home with them.
Yeah, that's right. And there is a relative weakness to spoken words in comparison to sung words. So I don't think I have ever visited anybody or given commendation of the dying to anybody or buried anybody who could remember what, even if they were a pastor's child, precise words their father said as their mind is going. They can remember music, right? So I can start, in that case, congregation that hadn't used the Lutheran hymnal since the 70s, immediate recall on page 5, page 15, if I start singing anything from TLH, anything, right there. Obviously the Lord's Prayer, so repeated spoken words, sure, but sermons are not repeated spoken words. So there's a humility that I think preachers have to have relative to, especially music they've known their whole life, that is going to have much greater power, for better or worse, than the words that we say generally in a one-off fashion, right? And I'll just leave you with this little anecdote. If you are worried about the relative weakness of spoken words, and then we'll take our break, is that you could do what was for a long time done by the longtime pastor of St. Paul's in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is he just had 4 funeral sermons, and he rotated them depending on the occasion. So most people got a certain standard sermon. This is the funeral sermon. I'm sure that someone could actually recall most of that sermon word for word, especially the ladies that prepared the luncheon afterward, because I'm sure many of them heard it 20, 30, 40 times. But generally, we're not doing that. So our words just aren't that memorable, and that's okay. I'm aiming for something. I can build them up even if they can't say in 5 years what I said.
So I just recall just 10 days ago, Pastor Cheryl, probably 20 times in the sermon said fire, water, and blood. Yeah. And then you repeated it.
I did it in Bible class. Well, I'm trying to, help the sermon and say, here's what's going on, but what did he say about fire, water, and blood? Yep, that's where I'm at too. Yeah. So we'll remember something about it. I just don't know what we will remember. Let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 4:45.